how about just be kind and human and interesting and let people want to talk to you because they like you. And then, maybe share a little bit about the business or maybe let them find out on their own. You could just be somebody that has such a strong point of view or perspective, or maybe you're an expert on a specific topic that a lot of employers are interested in. You become someone that they trust to ask questions and learn from. And you also run this business. Like, I'd love to find out more on my own. And that's a much more, I think, authentic, genuine way to deliver on kind of a sales goal than showing up and just kind of ramming a presentation down someone's throat.
That's Chrissy Farr, Editor-in-Chief and CEO of Second Opinion Media, a weekly newsletter on the intersection of healthcare and technology, and the author of the new book, The Storyteller's Advantage, a case for why clear, compelling narratives are essential for businesses. I'm Ellen Kelsey, and this is the Business Group on Health podcast, conversations with experts on the most relevant health and well-being issues facing employers. Chrissy Farr spent years covering healthcare as a journalist. Today, she tells us why the art of storytelling is a crucial skill for all companies to learn, and how it can be a particularly helpful skill for health and well-being leaders to more effectively communicate and drive impact. Chrissy, welcome. It's so fun having you on the podcast today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, you have been a longtime friend of mine and Business Group on Health, and you have worn many, many hats, and you're so well known. I hate to ask you to introduce yourself, but maybe for the sake of the audience who is not as familiar with you, give us a rundown of who you are and what you've done.
Yeah, happy to do that. So primarily wear two hats today. One is as the editor-in-chief and CEO of a newsletter called Second Opinion, which is really about everything going on in healthcare technology that impacts folks that listen to this podcast. So anybody in the employer, broker space, lots of startups, venture capitalists, really all of us in the health tech community. And then I also run a venture capital fund called Scrub Capital that invests in pre-seed and seed. So really underlying everything I do is this thesis that community and content can really feed each other. And with the right people at the table, if you can be really inclusive about kind of the way that you approach people and ask lots of questions and bring in expertise from around the industry, I just really think it makes for both more interesting content as well as a really good potential platform to invest.
You are just so prolific, and your writing is always compelling. You cover so many fascinating topics. I definitely want to get to, perhaps later in the conversation, your work at Second Opinion. But I wanted to start with, first, a book that you recently released called The Storyteller's Advantage. Why'd you write the book?
The book, I don't know if you have any vision at some point in life of writing a book, but for me, it was a bucket list thing that I always wanted to do. And my first piece of advice to people who are interested in this is pick a topic that you could genuinely be interested in for a decade, because it can take that long to write a book. For me, it took about 5 years. The topic that really interested me was this idea that storytelling is such a powerful catalyst to any business, really. We just don't take it that seriously as a community, especially in technology, where I have spent a lot of my career. We're obsessed with numbers and metrics and everything measurable, right? And we think of storytelling as this thing that PR firms do, communications people, something that you can just fully outsource. And yet the CEOs, the leaders that view storytelling as their problem, as their job, I have seen have outsized success. As I dug in and I spoke to leaders across every sector, not just healthcare, people like the founders of Box and Reddit and Casper Mattress, they all said they would have been half as successful as they were if they hadn't taken storytelling seriously. I essentially kind of produced with the book this series of almost HBR style case studies where I looked at one company at a time, went deep on that business, went deep with the founder, CEO, and the team, and just elaborated on how they were able to leverage storytelling and what it did for them as a business, and then try to make it accessible to anybody in any job.
I've read the book. It's fascinating. And you really did interview dozens upon dozens of people. It's fascinating, the range of people that you spoke with. Were there any in particular that were especially memorable?
Yeah, gosh, so many. I think Alexis Ohanian is one that really spoke to me. He was the founder of Reddit, which we all know now, but I've known him since really the early days. I used to be in the media. I worked at a bunch of different newsrooms like CNBC, Fast Company, and others. Alexis was just always accessible. He was always reaching out. He was the CEO, he was the founder, but he didn't have an entourage of people around him managing him. He would just send me, a Twitter DM, like, hey, I'm in town, let's meet up. Whenever I would talk to him, it just wasn't a promotional pitch fest about the business that he was building. He would always ask questions. He was always interested in what I had to say. Reading about kind of how he now that the business has obviously been very successful, he's investing now. He's looking for people like that to invest in now that he runs a venture capital fund, people who aren't so transactional, who don't show up expecting something and wanting something with every encounter, including with the media, who actually know how to build those relationships on their own. So I thought that was fascinating. And then just to give you one little example, I don't know if you knew this, but Reddit was acquired by Condé Nast. And the backstory there was that Alexis had reached out to a mutual friend, actually of both of us, a journalist called Rachel Metz, who was then writing for a publication called Wired. He had said, hey, you want to meet up? I'm in town. And she said, I don't really cover Reddit, so I'm happy to meet up, but like, I'm not going to promise you any kind of coverage. And he was like, look, I just really would love to meet you. They met up and she was quite impressed with him. I don't think she ended up writing a story, but she found him impressive and mentioned him to her editor, who was married to a senior executive at Condé Nast. And she mentioned it to him at the dinner table. And that all led to this partnership and ultimately acquisition by Condé Nast. So he loves to tell that story of, both the butterfly effect, because it's a perfect example of that, but also just not showing up with this transactional mindset, including with the media. And I think a lot of companies do that. The vast majority do that. And those that don't, that just show up as humans and are curious and authentic, they just have these untold advantages that just play out over time in fascinating ways.
I love that. That's such a great example. And he sounds like an amazing person, just on a human level.
Yeah, he's now married to Serena Williams, which is so
Yeah.
funny.
Did you interview her?
I didn't, but I should have asked him. Like, hey, does Serena want to chat? I did interview so many fascinating humans. Another one I could have mentioned was Laura Modi, the founder of Bobby, who I love because she's so creative. You guys put out press releases. We all put out press releases, but Laura, she's got a formula company. And when they did an acquisition last year, she published the press release was literally a photo of her hugging the CEO of the company whose business she acquired, and they were both moms. When I talked to her, she's like, yeah, let's just throw out these rule books. There's no rule that says we have to do a boring press release. Why not a photo of two female entrepreneurs and mothers hugging? I just love that. I mean, I think we live by these rules, and sometimes we don't even know why the rules are there in the first place.
In addition to those great examples, I'm curious, like the characteristics of some of the best stories and the best storytellers. What are they doing that makes them so compelling?
I think the first one is authenticity, which sounds obvious, but most people show up in the world very scripted and coached. I run a podcast myself. Almost everybody I invite on the podcast wants topics ahead of time, questions ahead of time. They want to do as much scripting as possible. The whole thesis of the podcast is that it's so much more fun to have candid conversations with people that are real. But it's just in the world that we live in the business world, people are just not comfortable with that. And yet, it's those moments of raw authenticity, of showing who you are as a person, that make for the best storytellers. So I think we all need to just have a bit less anxiety about our personal brands and everything that we say, because the truth is that most people don't listen or care that much. I mean, it's sort of, weird to imagine there's a peanut gallery of people just sitting around saying like, what is Ellen saying? What is Chrissy saying? How do we like criticize them? It just doesn't exist. It's all in our own heads. So I think we can just take it down a notch or two and be a bit more ourselves. And I don't think anything that bad is going to happen. So that's a lot of the book, is just like, chill out, guys. Like, we're way too risk-averse, especially in the business world. I think empathy, I think surprise, I think not telling stories all the time that are just about how successful and great we are. A lot of businesses do that. These are not interesting stories. Think about like every Disney movie you've ever watched with your kids is the movie just 1 2 hour long run of somebody having great success? That would be the most boring movie. There's got to be something where the main character or hero falters and then has to pick themselves back up again. It's really just borrowing tropes, known tropes that you see across other industries like the entertainment industry, and then bringing them into the way that you tell stories.
Your book talks about the SOAP framework, and you just mentioned many of the elements. S stands for surprise, O is openness, A, authenticity. Tell us about the P. What is the P in SOAP?
That's really about pathos, empathy. It's not showing up with that transactional mindset. I think Alexis Ohanian was that great example. Thinking about who it is on the other end of the table that you're talking to. I think you see it, Ellen, in the employer world. When I talk with brokers, when I talk with employers, they just feel sold to, they feel pitched to all the time, especially by vendors. And it's just so uncommon that anybody shows up to a meeting and says, "What's on your mind? Who are you as a person? How can we relate to each other? What are your needs? What are your problems? What's going on with you?" I think that sort of curiosity and that just willingness to be human is oftentimes so lost because we show up with our messaging books and our talking points and our sales tactics, and we just need to hammer this pitch. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants to feel sold to. So I think a lot of the book is really about, just reminding folks that maybe just like settle that aside, and how about just be kind and human and interesting and let people want to talk to you because they like you, and then, maybe share a little bit about the business, or maybe let them find out on their own. You could just be somebody that has such a strong point of view or perspective, or maybe you're an expert on a specific topic that a lot of employers are interested in. You become someone that they trust to ask questions and learn from. And you also run this business. Like, I'd love to find out more on my own. And that's a much more, like, I think, authentic, genuine way to deliver on kind of a sales goal than showing up and just kind of ramming a presentation down someone's throat.
Oh my gosh, you're so right. And as you're saying all of those things, I can think of so many examples. And people are smart. They can sniff it out in 2 seconds if there's not an authenticity or a sense of humility, and you're just a person trying to connect on a human level and share some thoughts with another human being. To your point, nobody wants to be sold to. People don't like feeling as though they're part of an agenda that's trying to be accomplished. So it's so obvious what you're saying, but also so striking how often the opposite happens in our day-to-day business lives and personal lives.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's just even like you and I are at a lot of these dinners that get thrown across the community, and companies that sponsor them, they always want the same subset of potential customers to be there, but very few of them think about who the customers want to meet with. They don't want to just sit there with each other over dinner and feeling sold to. They want to sit next to people like you who can sit outside of the industry and maybe tell them what's going on, or they want to sit next to somebody from the policy world who can help them interpret what's going on in DC. You got to think in those ways of like, not just what do I want, but how can I help others in the room, and how can I convene people and support them in their own goals. And I think that's just a much better way of thinking, but it's just so rare to see it.
Well, you also said, and I love this in your book, that you said the best storytellers are also really good prognosticators. So expand on that for the audience.
Yeah, I mean, there's a subset of people out there, I think, that can kind of see into the future and I think help us interpret what's to come and how we should kind of react to some of those changes. I think a good example of that is Aaron Levy from Box, who has, I think, 3 million followers on Twitter. And if you look at him, like, he's a CEO of a publicly traded company. So you would expect a lot of that following would be, people who want to show up and hear about what he's doing at Box. But he's really well known in the media world, and he is followed because he's also an expert on trends around how people work, and specifically what AI will mean for the future of work. So that's what he primarily talks about. And you see him all over television, that he's always on CNBC. When I was at CNBC, we had him on all the time because he would just come on and, like you said, prognosticate about, are we going to see disruptions around return to office in light of the pandemic, or Is AI going to replace a subset of jobs or is it not going to? And what kinds of work should we all be doing in the future? And what should our kids be thinking about in terms of jobs that they should be doing? He was the perfect person to talk about those things. And he would never mention his own business. He wouldn't just go on TV and say, here's a few thoughts about the question that you asked, but really, I'm going to promote Box, which I think a lot of comms teams would tell you is the right thing to do. He would just be interesting and answer your questions and be really genuine and authentic. And I think also had very smart perspectives because he was really erudite, just very well read, and an intellect. Because of that, I think his business had a ton of success. Even in a really crowded category, he was competing against Google and Amazon and Dropbox, which were all kind of better capitalized companies. But his company just kept chugging along. And a lot of that was due to the personal brand that he built and just how well liked he was within the industry. So I think that was another great example of like, you don't have to just go on stage and go on television and promote the thing that you're doing. You can also just be a prognosticator. You can be an expert about Medicare or CMS or, the employer channel and talk about that. And I think the opportunities will come just because you're interesting and relevant. And that's all you need to do. And I think that's freeing for a lot of people, probably you and I included, who don't feel naturally comfortable promoting things. We're much more comfortable in the space of sharing our thoughts and expertise.
Well, and I'd like to ask you too, you've talked about the employer channel, you've talked about people selling to employers. What about employers themselves? How would you, sitting here talking to an audience of HR, total rewards, benefit leaders who might be listening, how can they think about the art of storytelling within their work, whether it's storytelling to their workforce about perhaps a big change that they might be undertaking, or storytelling to their executives when they're trying to make a business case for something? Any words of advice to employers and folks listening out there from kind of the human resources realm?
I think the job is really tough from everything I've heard because there's so much compliance and legal, and it's just so hard to get anything through, especially around education to employees and members. And yet they spend so much money on these benefits that nobody knows about, nobody uses. So clearly there is some kind of massive disconnect happening. And I think it might be that we have to take a little bit more of a risk forward mindset where, there is a subset of things that just cannot be done. So set those aside. Let's take an example that I've been trying to get somebody to do in the employer world, which is your employees, they're all using TikTok. They're on like Instagram. This is where they spend hours of time a day, for better or for worse. And the other day I was on TikTok and I saw a bunch of amazing, self-generated video content about Maven Clinic in the women's health space. People were just on there organically talking about how they use the Maven Clinic benefit and thanking their employer for making it available to them and talking about how easy it was. And I ended up sending some of these to Kate Ryder, and she texted back and was like, oh yeah, like we love all this when we see it. But I don't see employers developing programs to just support that kind of thing and maybe provide some incentives to employees that will generate this kind of content to talk in really accessible ways about the benefits that they use and how they use them. And that's just one example, but I think it's really outside the box thinking. Like maybe you could do an advisory board within the employer of like extremely online kind of Gen Zs who are now entering into the workplace. Bring them together once a month to just share ideas of like, how would you get the word out about the benefits that are available? How do you talk to people about things like cost and deductibles and all the stuff that confuses everybody about healthcare? It confuses me about healthcare. Could you do like some campaigns around open enrollment? Could you talk to people about specific issues like navigation or LGBTQI related issues and finding good providers that can be empathetic to your needs? How do you talk about women's health and the benefits that are available there? What about behavioral health? I think there's so many opportunities if we could just, again, get a little bit more creative and experimental than we have been. And I don't necessarily think it's to call up the same people, on the consultant broker side. I think they're very good at certain things, but you got to be thinking differently when it comes to this kind of digital marketing, which could be a lot more user generated, a lot more grassroots. and sit outside of the HR organization, but then be closely tied to it. Again, finding incentives, finding opportunities to give people within the organization who are naturally wired to do this kind of thing, like how do you get them involved and educating them? So those are just a few ideas, but I would love to see that for more employers and HR teams.
Those are great examples. I like the advisory board of Gen Z, the risk forward mindset thinking and framing of that issue. So those are really good examples for folks out there listening to ponder and to perhaps explore and put into practice. That's great.
What are you seeing, Ellen? Anything really creative about that?
It's interesting. We are thinking a lot about disruption and the need, as you said, these jobs are really hard. People who are in total rewards and benefit roles right now are juggling a lot of very heady, heavy topics, whether it's compliance or cost or population health or skepticism about public health messaging. And, they are becoming more of the trusted resource on messaging that perhaps they hadn't thought that was their role to do previously. And so things are coming at employers fast and really intensely. And they're putting a lot of thought into how they communicate, when they don't communicate, and why. And this notion of disruption and the need to do things differently and perhaps do some things that are revolutionary, but that doesn't necessarily mean bad. I think for a lot of people, disruption has this negative connotation. And so we've seen employers think about the framing of change and the change as a path to something better and doing a lot of focus groups and communication related to disruption and disruption being a force for good, not a path to something worse. So that's just one thing that really is, as I think about change management from the employer lens, something that I think is very ripe with opportunity. It's necessary in the time we are in right now and does require some different techniques than kind of the old staid communication modalities of, open enrollment communication and benefits portal. It takes a higher degree of intentionality and precision. I think also, engagement from senior executives in the C-suite around some of this disruptive, forces and a movement towards something hopefully better on the other side of all of this. So, the business case and the conversation and the story that total rewards leaders need to share internally, not only with their workforce, but also internally with their executives around the need for some of these things.
It's a really tough moment. And I'm talking to folks on the total reward side who are like, my costs are going to go up substantially. And the CFO is saying, that's not possible. Like, we cannot have that. What are the levers that you need to pull? Everybody seems to be kind of looking at what's out there related to things that are maybe more kind of based on outcomes and performance, and then lots of interest in some of these kind of value-based care-like approaches that are now making their way into the commercial space. As you know, we've talked about quite a bit. Things like reference-based pricing and lots of the centers of excellence stuff. And it all seems to be now kind of reaching a bit more of a tipping point, which is exciting. But then simultaneously, I think the employees need to understand more. And I think we sometimes assume that people can't understand or lack the education or the literacy. But if you explain to somebody, hey, you need this high price procedure, but where you get that procedure and the physician that treats you can really impact price. And a higher price doesn't necessarily mean you'll get a better outcome. In the system, I don't think it's impossible to explain it. But I don't think that we have necessarily gone out of our way to explain it, which is, again, where the role of kind of communication and marketing comes in. Otherwise, my fear is that everything that employers try to do now to impact cost, employees will see this as, oh, our benefits are getting stripped back and we're going to get worse healthcare, when in reality, it might be the opposite.
That's the frame of disruption, and not necessarily being bad. What's the empathy and the outcome that is beneficial to the individual and helping them back to also the good prognosticators? How does that vision of the future paint the picture for the individual consumer, patient, employee, whomever it might be, to something that ultimately is beneficial for them? So telling that story and framing it in that way is going to be really important.
Yeah, I mean, we've all kind of been shielded historically from cost. But now if somebody says to me, your health insurance is already 27,000 for the family, and you're pushing me for all these additional things, we can do these things, but then it's going to be more than 27,000. Do you want that? And I think if you frame it in that way, people are like, oh, maybe we don't need that. Maybe we don't need GLP-1s given out to every single person within this employer population versus some kind of really interesting carve out program where we can subsidize some of these like much cheaper cash prices. All of that seems possible and with the right kind of framing.
I agree. And we don't need to make it any harder than it is. And sometimes I think we do unintentionally make it harder than it needs to be. So, exactly what you just said and how you phrased it, I think would resonate with so many people.
Yep, yep, exactly.
All right. If okay with you, I would love to shift gears and talk about second opinion and how you choose the topics you write about. There are so many things you could write about on any given day or week. So, what rises to the top?
Yeah, I'm definitely like a deep healthcare nerd, and the things that interest me, I honestly didn't know if there was a market for them for a long time. When I was in mainstream media, all these ideas, I would basically just not be able to really even pitch because at an NBC like publication, you really have a mainstream audience in mind. If Elon Musk does something in healthcare, that would be a worthy story. And a lot of people would read that, right? But we also don't know who's reading, really. It's like millions of random people who happen to click on that story through Facebook. And I think that model worked for a long time and now is struggling because the social media algorithms are referring a lot less to traditional news sources. And that's a whole different topic. But when I started my own newsletter, I felt kind of unleashed, and all the ideas that I had that were just, I call them hiding in plain sight stories. A good example, just from the space that you and I both spend time in. I looked at teamed up with Brian Marcotte, who listeners will know well, and
Yes.
you know well, and we looked at this trend in digital health of this question mark around should I directly contract with an employer or kind of do more of a D2C direct to consumer motion where we just get a network with payers. And then we looked at how these decisions are being made and we went deep on company business models. We looked at Oshi and MIDI and Maven, all these companies. That was a great piece that like really had a bit of a viral moment for my publication, Second Opinion, that 20,000 people read that. And I got so many emails and calls and texts from a lot of people in the industry, employers and brokers and consultants who said, we've been seeing the same thing. It's been talked about behind closed doors, but nobody's written the piece yet. So that's a great example of something that Second Opinion wants to be at the forefront of. And I think we were also very early to kind of the point solution dialogue as well, which now is something that everybody's talking about. And, we all know what that means. But Second Opinion kind of jumped on that before really any mainstream outlet did. So we look for these kinds of trends where in a dinner setting over a glass of wine, you might say, oh, have you noticed X or Y? And somebody might say, oh, yeah, we're starting to notice that too. But it's not really been articulated and it needs a framework. It needs to be synthesized and it needs a framework around what it means and how to think about it. That's where I like to spend time.
Such a fun place to be. And I was on a brainstorming call with you and a bunch of other folks about a week or so ago. And it was really fascinating to hear different ideas being percolated. So I'm curious, what's next on your radar? Anything, a handful of things that perhaps you're tracking, any one or two really come to the forefront of topics you're next going to be focused on?
I think there's just a tremendous amount happening right now. I can barely keep up. I think a lot the policy side of things is really interesting to me. We just saw MA rates. The government said they're not going to go up. So the impact on health plans, I think everything happening in Medicare is going to be really interesting to watch over the coming years. I'm super interested in kind of the shift to pay for outcomes and performance that we're seeing across the board. I'm interested in whether or not AI will be inflationary or deflationary. I think a lot of the early examples that we've seen have been inflationary, and I'm happy to dig in there. But I don't think that AI is necessarily going to cut any costs out of the system if not used in ways where the incentives are better set up. Right now, it's just kind of sitting on top of a broken system. So I think that's an interesting topic that we should dig into. I'm actually thinking about writing something about the performance of some of these first IPOs in digital health, like Omada and Hinge, and how the performance of those companies has been impacted by the SaaS bloodbath and how fair is that? Those are the kinds of things that I'm digging into and many, many more. Ellen, as you know, like it's not just me that writes for Second Opinion. I love bringing in perspectives from people across the industry. We love first person opinion kind of columns, that kind of thing. I love to team up with people. Like if you said, "Hey, Chrissy, there's this thing, nobody's talking about it. Let's get it out there." Boom, let's do it. I'm a big Google Docs collaboration fan. So I'm constantly doing things like that across the industry with people who have perspectives but maybe struggle a bit to put pen to paper. Yeah, it's like all of that stuff. It's just the nerdy stuff, the fun stuff that we all kind of live and breathe every day.
I think that's what makes your newsletter so it's just so fascinating because your expertise alone and just your knowledge that is so expansive on so many topics. But then, as you said, you also bring in guest contributors, whether they're co-authoring something with you or if it's more of a, an FAQ where you're kind of asking them questions and they're responding to it. You infuse the newsletter with so many other really additional fascinating perspectives above and beyond what you're already bringing to it. And so it's really, a unique platform to hear from a lot of different people on a wide range of topics. And I am curious, what do you think employers should be paying attention to that maybe isn't on their radar? Or as anticipate what lies ahead in the next 6-12 months, something that employers should be paying closer attention to?
Yeah, I'm really worried the next year or two are just going to get even more expensive. I mean, that seems to be the trend. I'm sure you would agree with that. I was just with a payer last week who said they got a first ever $14 million medical claim. I think we're at the point where we need to really figure out ways to just ensure that these really, really high cost events don't happen, get people out of really high cost settings as much as possible. In this case, it was a really, really extended NICU stay. That's just a great example of there is so much that we can do to ahead of, in some cases, you can't prevent a NICU stay, but in many cases, you can with proper obstetric care. That's just another thing that I think employers need to be thinking about more and more and more is how do you really get people to show up to the medical care that they need and prevent these high cost problems that can happen. It's these $14 million medical bills that are really driving up costs more than anything else. I think we'll see that more and more with specialty drugs going up and being used more. And now people are talking more about cell and gene therapies. Everything is going to get more and more expensive. And we just have to figure out ways to treat people before it even gets there, wherever possible.
I've been calling it the it gets worse before it gets better scenario. And I think the next, certainly 2026, 2027 gets worse before hopefully it gets better. And it's all the things you just said. It's technology on top of a broken system, AI being inflationary, not deflationary, the population health decline, the cost shift from, the reduction in reimbursement from government funding on government sponsored programs. That leads to cost shift to employers, and then independent dispute resolution and what we're seeing happen there and the upcoding from AI. So yeah, it takes a lot of intentionality. And back to my point around disruption, the need to do something different to contend with that dynamic. But that's kind of doom and gloom. And I don't like to end our podcast on a sour note. So let's close with a note of optimism. And as you think about the vantage point and the intersection of the industry that you sit at, what gives you hope and promise as you think about the future?
Yeah, I mean, Alan, I think it's talking to folks like Bob Wachter, who I just had on my own podcast, who wrote the seminal work about digital health. And, he called it hype and hope and harm. And he wrote this whole book based on this era of digital health that I think we saw through kind of the 2005 to 2020 era, of which we had some big kind of bubble bursting moments. And how impactful really was that technology in healthcare, especially if you think about things like EHRs, if you think about some of the early digital health companies that just were nudging people to do things that they didn't do. There was just so much in that era that just did not work. And his new book is A Giant Leap. That's the name of the book. We just spent the past, couple hours talking about the real potential in AI. There hasn't been anything like this yet. We can't really compare it to the prior technology innovations and waves of technology that we've seen in the past that really haven't lived up to expectations and hype. I'm kind of there. There are ways in which AI is still overhyped. I don't think that it's going to replace like all human empathy, and there are times that we do need to speak to a person, and I'm really not of the mindset that physicians will be replaced. Like Bob was saying, if I'm replaced as a physician, it's because you're out of a job, it's because Ellen's out of a job, it's because every lawyer in America is out of a job, because of all the compliance and the risk and the liability and the need for human connection that is unique to medicine. It's probably the last industry that will see humans getting fully replaced. But I do think that there is this potential where, we've been in this scarcity mindset for the last number of decades where there just simply has not been enough care available to those who need it, and therefore it's been priced high. Now we might be moving into a future where that kind of care becomes abundant, especially related to treating much lower acuity conditions. And I think that's a future that could frankly change everything. If we think about it in the right ways and we don't overregulate it, are we finally going to be leading to a future where we all get kind of accessible care that we deserve, and healthcare isn't the most expensive, inflationary part of our economy?
Well, what a good place to end. And Christy, thank you so much for joining me in conversation. I appreciate, as I started the call, your friendship and support and partnership on a personal level and, of course, professionally. And just so grateful that you have shared your insight and your authenticity on all things that you're involved in with our audience today. So thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, Ellen, and back at you. And then I also would love to, anybody tuning in who wants to collaborate, I would love to just invite you to subscribe to the newsletter. It's free to get our updates. Email me anytime. I'm very accessible and will do my best to respond, and may even say, well, that's a great idea. Let's team up and do something together. Would love to collaborate with anybody tuning in that has an idea.
Awesome. And we'll put the link to all your contacts in the show notes for anybody who's interested in reaching out to you.
Thank you so much, Ellen.
I've been speaking with Chrissy Farr, the author of The Storyteller's Advantage and CEO of Second Opinion Media, an outlet where you can read articles like The Signals Shaping Healthcare Right Now and We're Entering into the Era of the AI Doctor, as well as many others. I'm Ellen Kelsey, and this podcast is produced by Business Group on Health with Connected Social Media. If you like this episode, please rate us and leave a review.